Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are the cornerstone of the New Testament and central to Christian faith. They chronicle the life, teachings, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Traditionally, these books have been attributed to four distinct authors, each believed to have had a close connection to the events they describe or to the apostles who were eyewitnesses. However, modern scholarship has cast doubt on these traditional attributions, leading to a fascinating and complex debate over who actually wrote the Gospels. This essay will explore the traditional views of Gospel authorship, the challenges posed by modern biblical scholarship, and the ongoing mystery that surrounds these ancient texts. For nearly 1,700 years, the authorship of the Gospels was not a matter of significant debate. The early Church Fathers and subsequent Christian tradition maintained that the Gospels were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, each of whom was either an apostle or closely associated with the apostolic community. The Gospel of Matthew was traditionally attributed to Matthew, a tax collector who became one of Jesus' 12 apostles. According to church tradition, Matthew wrote his Gospel to address a Jewish audience, emphasizing Jesus as the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies. This Gospel is structured to present Jesus as the new Moses, a teacher of divine law, and the long-awaited Messiah. The Gospel of Mark is believed to have been written by John Mark, a companion of the Apostle Peter. The early church historian Eusebius, citing the work of Papias, Bishop of Hierapolis, claimed that Mark recorded Peter's recollections and teachings about Jesus. Mark's Gospel is often regarded as the earliest of the four, and it is characterized by its concise, fast-paced narrative and emphasis on the suffering and humanity of Jesus. The Gospel of Luke is traditionally attributed to Luke, a physician and companion of the Apostle Paul. Luke's Gospel is part of a two-volume work that includes the Acts of the Apostles. It is often noted for its attention to detail, historical context, and its particular concern for the marginalized and the poor. Luke's narrative is distinctive in its inclusivity, highlighting the role of women, Gentiles, and social outcasts in the story of Jesus. The Gospel of John is ascribed to John, the beloved disciple who was part of Jesus' inner circle. This Gospel is markedly different from the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, in style and content. It presents a more theological reflection on Jesus' identity, emphasizing his divinity and pre-existence. The Gospel of John contains lengthy discourses and is less focused on chronological order, offering a more interpretive and spiritual portrayal of Jesus. These traditional attributions were largely unchallenged until the Enlightenment, when scholars began to apply critical historical methods to the study of biblical text. This shift marked the beginning of a new era in biblical scholarship, one that raised significant questions about the authorship of the Gospels. The 18th century saw the advent of the Enlightenment, a period characterized by an emphasis on reason, science, and critical thinking. This intellectual movement had a profound impact on biblical studies, as scholars began to scrutinize the Bible not just as a sacred text but as a historical document subject to the same critical analysis as any other ancient work. One of the earliest and most significant developments in modern biblical scholarship was the recognition of the so-called synoptic problem. This term refers to the striking similarities between the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which are often called the Synoptic Gospels because they can be viewed together or with one eye. These three Gospels share a large amount of material, often word for word, which suggests that they are not independent accounts but rather interdependent in some way. The similarities between the Synoptic Gospels led scholars to propose various theories to explain their relationship. The most widely accepted of these theories is the two-source hypothesis. According to this hypothesis, the Gospel of Mark was the earliest of the three Synoptic Gospels and served as a source for both Matthew and Luke. This would explain why much of the content of Mark is found in both Matthew and Luke. In addition to Mark, scholars have posited the existence of a second source, commonly referred to as Q, from the German word Quelle, meaning source. The Q source is hypothesized to be a collection of sayings of Jesus that was used by both Matthew and Luke, but not by Mark. While no physical evidence of Q has ever been discovered, the theory remains influential because it accounts for the material common to Matthew and Luke that is not found in Mark. The two-source hypothesis challenged the traditional view of gospel authorship by suggesting that Matthew and Luke were not independent eyewitness accounts, but were instead dependent on earlier written sources. This raised further questions about the identity of the authors. If Matthew, for example, was an apostle and an eyewitness to Jesus' ministry, why would he need to rely on Mark's account? The Gospel of Mark is often considered the earliest of the Gospels, likely written around AD 70. The traditional attribution of Mark to John Mark, a companion of Peter, is based on early church testimony, particularly the writings of Papias, who claimed that Mark's Gospel was a record of Peter's preaching. However, modern scholars are divided on whether John Mark was indeed the author. Some scholars suggest that Mark's Gospel reflects not just Peter's teachings but also a broader tradition of oral storytelling about Jesus. In the 1st century, oral tradition was the primary means by which stories and teachings were transmitted. These oral accounts were likely adapted and shaped by the communities in which they were told, resulting in a variety of versions of the Jesus story. The Gospel of Mark, then, may represent one attempt to commit these oral traditions to writing in a coherent narrative form. The possibility that Mark's Gospel was based on oral tradition rather than direct eyewitness testimony complicates the question of authorship. If the Gospel was shaped by a community rather than a single individual, then the notion of Mark as the sole author becomes less certain. This perspective opens the door to the idea that the Gospels may have been the product of collective authorship, with multiple contributors shaping the final text. The Gospel of Luke is notable for its detailed preface, in which the author states that he has carefully investigated everything from the beginning and intends to write an orderly account for Theophilus, likely a patron or sponsor of the work. This preface gives Luke's Gospel a distinctly historical tone, suggesting that the author was concerned with providing an accurate and reliable account of events. Traditionally, Luke has been identified as a physician and companion of Paul, as mentioned in several of Paul's letters. However, modern scholarship has raised questions about this identification. Some scholars argue that the author of Luke Acts, the two-volume work that includes the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles, may have been a well-educated Greek-speaking Christian who was not necessarily a companion of Paul but was familiar with Pauline theology. The historical approach of Luke's Gospel has led some scholars to suggest that the author may have had access to a variety of written and oral sources, including Mark's Gospel, the hypothetical Q source, and other traditions. This raises the possibility that Luke was more of a compiler or editor than a traditional author, bringing together different sources to create a cohesive narrative. The Gospel of John stands apart from the Synoptic Gospels in both style and content. It is often described as more theological because of its focus on the divinity of Jesus and its use of symbolic language. The traditional attribution of this Gospel to John, the beloved disciple, is supported by early church tradition, but modern scholarship has cast doubt on this identification. One of the key differences between John and the Synoptic Gospels is its chronology. John's Gospel presents a different timeline of Jesus' ministry, with events such as the cleansing of the temple occurring at the beginning of Jesus' public life rather than near the end. John also includes material not found in the Synoptics, such as the lengthy discourses of Jesus and the raising of Lazarus. Because of these differences, some scholars argue that the Gospel of John was written by a different community or school of thought than the Synoptics. The author, or group of authors, may have been less concerned with providing a historical account and more focused on interpreting the significance of Jesus' life and teachings for a particular theological perspective. The question of authorship is further complicated by the possibility that the Gospel of John underwent multiple stages of development. Some scholars suggest that the Gospel may have been composed in layers, with an original core text being expanded and revised over time by different contributors. This process of composition challenges the idea of a single author and suggests, instead, a collaborative effort within a community of believers. Despite the advances in modern biblical scholarship, the question of who wrote the Gospels remains unresolved. The traditional attributions to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John continue to be upheld by many within the Christian faith, but the insights of historical critical methods have led to a more nuanced understanding of these texts. The possibility that the Gospels were written by followers of the apostles rather than the apostles themselves raises important questions about the nature of these texts. Are the Gospels primarily historical documents, or are they theological reflections shaped by the beliefs and needs of early Christian communities? Can the traditional attributions be reconciled with the evidence of shared sources and oral traditions? These are the questions that continue to fuel scholarly debate and inspire deeper exploration into the origins of the Gospels. While the question of who wrote the Gospels is intriguing and significant, it is important to recognize that the value and impact of these texts do not solely rest on their authorship. For Christians, the Gospels are seen as divinely inspired, regardless of the human hands that penned them. They have been revered as sacred scripture, providing spiritual guidance, moral teachings, and a profound connection to the life and mission of Jesus Christ. From a theological perspective, the Gospel's authority does not depend on the identity of their authors but rather on their role as witnesses to the revelation of God in Christ. The early church recognized these texts as authoritative because they faithfully conveyed the core message of the Christian faith, the good news of salvation through Jesus. This recognition was based on the content and impact of the Gospels rather than on strict historical authorship. Moreover, the Gospels have had a profound influence on Western culture, art, literature, and ethics. They have shaped the moral and spiritual foundations of countless societies and continue to be a source of inspiration for billions of people around the world. The teachings of Jesus, as recorded in the Gospels, have transcended time and place, offering a vision of love, compassion, justice, and peace that resonates across cultures and epochs. The question of who wrote the Gospels is one of the great mysteries of biblical scholarship. While traditional attributions to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John have been accepted for centuries, modern research has introduced compelling alternative theories. These theories suggest that the Gospels may have been the result of complex processes of oral tradition, source compilation, and community authorship rather than the work of single individuals. Despite these scholarly debates, the Gospels continue to be cherished as the foundational texts of the Christian faith. They offer a unique window into the life and teachings of Jesus, serving as a bridge between the historical figure of Jesus and the spiritual beliefs of Christian communities. Whether viewed as historical documents, theological reflections, or both, the Gospels remain central to the Christian tradition and to the understanding of one of the most influential figures in human history. The ongoing exploration of Gospel authorship invites us to engage more deeply with these texts, not only as historical artifacts but as living documents that continue to speak to the human experience. As scholars, theologians, and believers continue to study the Gospels, the mystery of their origins may never be fully resolved. However, this mystery does not diminish the power and significance of the Gospels. Rather, it enriches our appreciation of these ancient texts and the enduring message they convey. In the end, the question of who wrote the Gospels may be less important than the question of what the Gospels mean to us today. As we read and reflect on these sacred writings, we are invited to encounter the message of Jesus in a way that transcends authorship, connecting us to a tradition that has shaped the course of history and continues to inspire faith, hope, and love in the hearts of millions. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button to explore another biblical mystery next week.